Assalamu alaikum. If you just joined us, you are listening to Footprints of the Creator. Your host for this evening, as usual, is myself, Yusuf, and Abdul Kader.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Today's program we are going to discuss some very important verses in the Quran with regard to the sea, the importance and benefit which man derives from it. Now there are a number of verses in the Quran which point out to the seas, and these verses highlight its usefulness to man. The first verse is found in Surah 14 verse 32, where we are told, Allah has made the ship subjected to you so that it runs upon the sea at His command. Now there are a few very important points here that need to be highlighted. Firstly, Allah tells us that Allah has made the ship subjected to us. He wants us to realize that we must not take credit for our skill and strength in the creation of the ships, or in any achievement for that matter. We have to realize that behind our strength, our skill and intelligence, there is the power and goodness of Allah. He gave us all these things. We cannot take credit for this. Secondly, the second point that we can learn from this verse is that man is able to understand and control the forces of nature and bring them to his own service. This is only possible for two reasons. Number one, Allah has given him these forces of nature as a gift for his use. And secondly, Allah has made fixed, definite laws in nature, and man has been able to learn these laws and gain control and mastery of these laws and use it for his purpose. So Allah has planned, and everything we have discussed runs according to plan, runs according to law. So when man discovers these laws, then only can he utilize them for his benefit. So we must realize that any of our achievements, no matter how big or small, we must not become arrogant and proud and think that it is of our own creation. But rather, we must always give thanks to Allah who has enabled it and made it possible for us. The second verse with regard to the sea is found in Surah 16 verse 14. And I quote, Allah is the one who subjected the sea so that you eat fresh meat from it, and you extract from it ornaments which you wear. Thou seest the ships ploughing the waves, so that you seek of His bounty. Maybe you will be thankful. Again, one or two points here which Allah brings to our attention. Firstly, He mentions the benefits of the seas in the form of fresh meat. Now, have you ever, we routinely buy fish and enjoy tasty, fresh, succulent food. But have you ever marveled at the fact that this fish, which is so sweet and palatable, comes from a bitter, salty ocean? And yet, from such a bitter, salty ocean, we get tender, palatable fish. This in itself is a sign of Allah's blessing and mercy to man. Secondly, Allah gives us another benefit of the ocean, is that we derive our ornaments from it. We all know too well of man diving for pearls, for various rubies, pearls which he picks up from the ocean, various ornaments which he gets from the seas. This he utilizes for his own benefit. And again, Allah draws our attention to the ships that plow the waves. These ships are there for commerce. They are used to communicate between men in different countries, and they also should serve the purpose of unifying mankind, of making man one nation, so that no person is out of reach. Even from one end of the continent to the other end of the world, Allah has enabled man to utilize ships so that we can communicate with one another. So this should be a unifying force. Another verse which deals with the seas is found in Surah 31 verse 31, and we are told, Hast thou seen that the ship runs upon the sea by the grace of Allah, in order to show you His signs? Verily, in this are signs for all who are persevering and are grateful. Again, the same message is reinforced. It is only through the mercy of Allah that the ship can run on the sea. And Allah says, look, ponder, reflect on His mercy and give thanks to Him. The final verse which I'd like to quote with regard to the sea and the benefits which man derives from it is found in Surah 36 verse 41 to 44. And I quote, A sign for them is that He bore their offspring in the loaded ark. We have created for them similar vessels on which they ride. If we will, we could drown them, and there is no help, and they will not be saved unless by mercy from us, and as a gratification for a time. Now this verse refers to the time of the Prophet Noah, when Allah, as a punishment, wiped out man for his sins, but he saved the believing few. Noah was told to collect the believers and the animals in his ark. So Allah has taught man how to master the ocean. And Allah has said, had He wanted to, He could have made us drown in the floods. But out of His mercy, He has taught us the skill of riding on the ocean. From these verses, we understand that ships sail and stay afloat only by the grace of Allah. Allah has made the sea subject to man. Now how does this occur? As I've mentioned, there are fixed, definite laws which Allah has put in place, and man is able to utilize these laws for his benefit. Let us look from a scientific point of view how it is possible for the ship to float on the sea using the fixed laws which Allah has created for man's benefit. Now I ask you to bear with me as I'm going to go in a bit of technical details, but it is important. For firstly, it shows the law that operates in this earth, and secondly, how man has learned from this law and brought it and mastered it and utilized it for his benefit. Now we know all liquids exert a pressure, and as you go deeper into water, the pressure increases. The deeper you go, the greater there is the force that pushes you upwards. Now this is the principle of what is known as buoyancy. To go back a bit in history, Archimedes was a Greek scientist. He can be credited with having discovered the laws of buoyancy. This, strangely enough, he discovered whilst he was in his bathtub. It suddenly hit him as to exactly what happens when people or when an object is immersed in water. And he was so excited with the discovery that he actually ran through the streets literally naked, shouting, "Eureka!" So from that time, a principle known as the Archimedes principle has been established, which defines the law of buoyancy. Now I'm going to quote this principle, and I will give an example so that it has become clearer for us to understand. Now Archimedes principle is basically as follows. It states, an object placed in a liquid seems to lose an amount of weight which is equal to the weight of fluid it displaces. Now what does that mean? Let's take a practical example. Say we have a bucket filled with water. In this bucket of water, now this bucket is filled right till the brim. We immerse a heavy metal ball into the bucket. Automatically, water is going to overflow from the bucket. Now if we collect all the water which overflows and weigh it, say it weighs 5 kilos, this would mean that the heavy metal ball which we inserted into the bucket will weigh 5 kilogram less whilst it is in the water, because it displaced water equal to 5 kilos which we collected. There is this force which is exerted upwards on it. If, for example, when we put the heavy metal object into the bucket of water and the water overflowed, and we collected this water which overflowed, and this water weighed 6 kilograms, then it would mean that the heavy metal object would actually weigh 6 kilograms less in the water in which it was immersed, because that is the amount of weight which it actually has displaced. So there is this force which push upwards, and it is proportionate to the amount of water which is displaced by the object. This is the force of buoyancy, and it causes an apparent loss of weight when any object is submerged in water. So from this we can deduce, the greater the amount of water that an object displaces, the greater the force which is present, which pushes the object upwards and causes an apparent loss in weight. Now the ship which floats on the sea, it is actually pushed by a force which is equal to the weight of the water which it displaces. And the ship floats simply because it displaces a volume of water greater than its actual weight. Therefore, the force is greater, that there's a greater force pushing the ship upwards and preventing it from sinking, because it displaces a volume of water greater than the actual weight of the ship. Now this principle of buoyancy man has mastered and learnt. Therefore we can build ships and are able to float on the sea. I mean, have you ever wondered, ships weighing literally hundreds of tons, but yet they will never sink? This in itself is a marvel, not because of man's ingenuity, but because Allah has created fixed and definite laws in this earth, in the sea, which enables man to utilize and derive benefit from it. Again, another important point from this Quranic verse. We have learned Allah has said man is able to use the ships and go from one place to another out of His grace. As I've mentioned, He has also brought to our attention that from the ocean we get our food, tasty, succulent fish. Fish actually amounts to approximately 140 million tons per year of fish is used by man. So it in itself is an important source of food, and not only food, also an important source of commerce for the fishermen. There are many different kinds of fish which are found in the salt waters, all of which are tender, juicy and succulent. And as I've mentioned, it is a marvel that we have got such a salty ocean and yet we get sweet, palatable fish. And the last benefit which Allah mentions to man is the ornaments which He has provided for man's beauty and decoration. The pearls which are found in the shells of oysters, the coral which is found under the seawater, the coral being a hard calcareous substance. This is secreted by the submarine polyps and it is used for their support and their habitation. There are many other gems which are found in the ocean, such as the carnelian, the agate, the goldstone, and various other variants. All these are also found not only in the seas but also in riverbeds. These gems, just like all the other gems which we find in the earth's crust, are actually manifestations of the highest architectural skill of the creator of the universe. So we can see the verses which I've read show the importance of the ocean, show Allah's benefit to man. It highlights that man must be grateful to Allah because Allah has created laws, man utilizes them, man derives food from the ocean and derives ornaments of beauty. We must not become arrogant and we must turn to Allah and forever repeat our thanks that Allah has been so merciful to us.
We now go on to discuss another very interesting concept as regards the seas. We find three very amazing references which refer to a strange phenomena. In Surah 25 verse 53, Allah says, Allah is the one who has let free the two seas or bodies of water. One is agreeable and sweet, the other salty and bitter. He placed a barrier between them, a partition that is forbidden to pass. From this Quranic ayah we see that Allah describes two streams or two bodies of water which are lying next to each other, but yet there's a barrier between them, and one is salty and the other sweet. There's another reference, Surah 35 verse 12. The two seas are not alike. The water of the one is agreeable, sweet, pleasant to drink, the other salty and bitter. You eat fresh meat from it, and you extract from it ornaments which you wear. And again, Surah 55 verses 19 to 22. He has let loose the two seas. They meet together. Between them is a barrier which they do not transgress. Out of them come pearls and corals. We see from this Quranic ayah that Allah describes a phenomenon in which two seas or two bodies of water come into contact and yet stay distinct from each other. And we are given a description of the salty water and the sweet water or fresh water not mixing. We also made reference to the different barriers between the seas in the last verse. Let us see what this phenomena is and see what it describes. Now we know that a phenomenon in which fresh water from rivers remains distinct from salty sea water, and there appears to be a barrier between them. Now, two rivers meeting and flowing onwards together without their waters mingling was a phenomenon which had obviously been observed by many people before. But this is observed when any large river enters the sea. We find that large quantities of salt water gush upstream at high tide, but the waters do not mix. The salt water forms one layer and the fresh water forms another layer. At low tide, the salt water recedes, leaving the fresh water as it was before, and it seems that there's a barrier between them that prevents them from mixing. It is only recently that we understand why and how this occurs. Modern research shows that the flow of liquids is governed by a difference in their salt content, and hence a difference in density, because the different salt contents causes the water to have different densities. So we find that because salt water is more denser than fresh water, when the two meet, the more salty water, that is, the more denser water, will flow beneath, and the fresh river water will flow above it. And so we find that there's two distinct layers, and there appears a barrier between them. Now this is also seen at the estuaries of the Tigris and the Euphrates. We find where they unite, there's a mass of water over 100 miles long, but this is called the Shatt al-Arab. And we see there's a distinct barrier between them, and it's amazing that this water doesn't mix. Another example is the Mississippi River joining the sea, and the same phenomenon is observed there as well. But perhaps the most amazing example is that of the Gulf Stream. Now the Gulf Stream begins at the equator. It passes northwards into the Gulf of Mexico. Now here it is about 80 kilometers wide and more than half a kilometer deep. And we find that this current is actually moving in relation to the other water. It's moving as a surface current at a speed of 5 kilometers per hour. That means it is distinct from the other water, and it does not mix with the other water. It moves along the coast to Newfoundland, then it moves east and becomes very much wider, up to 480 kilometers wide. It passes near the coast of Norway, France and England, and after this it passes and disappears into the ocean. Now after covering an amazing distance of thousands of miles, and all through this distance, the Gulf Stream appears distinct throughout this course, and it can be seen clearly as a difference in color. Not only this, we find another amazing fact, that the difference of the temperature between the Gulf Stream and the surrounding water is 20 degrees.
You know, an amazing thing, if you had to take a boat and put it at the actual junction of the Gulf Stream and immerse a bucket of water on one side and another bucket of water on the other side and measure the temperatures, just that slight difference on size from one side to the other, one side of the water will actually be 20 degrees higher than the other side. And yet there is no mixing or uniting of the temperatures. They just remain separate. Even the temperatures themselves are completely separated as such a close junction in the Gulf Stream.
This is absolutely amazing. I mean, if you just think about it. And yet, this is going on for thousands of miles. It's not just a chance occurrence. It's going on for thousands of miles. And throughout this, you can see the distinct difference. And you can see the difference in the two colors, which shows the difference between the two streams. And so we see that this phenomena in which fresh water does not mix with salty water is very important. In fact, if you think about it, if fresh river water was meeting the sea, and if they mixed and the waters became salty, then we find that the fresh water in rivers will become salty. And ultimately the salt water will continue until all the rivers will be salty. And hence we wouldn't have a source of fresh water. And life on this earth would become very difficult, if not impossible. In fact, the only source of fresh water then available would be rains. And then, one would rely on rains for survival. And then this, would obviously affect life in general. So this is a very important fact, that fresh water and salt water do not mix readily, even though they meet. So this is one of the wondrous workings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and very beautifully shows how Allah maintains order in this cosmos and maintains things so that they are for benefit for life and for man in particular. Now, if we look at the seas, we find that there's another phenomena which we referred to. We think that the sea appears as one sea, but actually scientists have found that the sea actually consists of different seas, which are distinguished by the degrees of the salt content, by the difference in their density, by the difference in the temperatures. Now this was only demonstrated in about 1942, and this too by the use of remote sensing devices, satellites, all using special scanners that photograph the differences in the seas using the thermal properties of the water. And using these fancy devices, they got photographs of the seas which differentiate this phenomena. Now we find that the sea is not homogeneous. It's not as we see it as one sea. In fact, it consists of a number of various layers, and these layers are separated from each other by barriers. And these barriers are seen, the different seas are seen as different colors. Now these barriers cannot be seen by the naked eye, but these are seen by this advanced technology and this research, and this also after setting up hundreds of marine research stations and using the most advanced technology and the most advanced equipment. Now to the naked eye we would think that the sea looks uniform, but there are partitions, there are barriers in the sea which can be seen with our present scientific research and techniques. Now this was described in the Quran 1400 years ago. I mean, an amazing fact which only through modern technology has come to light, revealed to the Prophet ﷺ 1400 years ago. Again makes us reflect, what is the source of the Quran? Could it be? It could never have come from any human source. It had to come from a divine source. In Surah 55 verses 19 to 20, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this phenomenon. He says, He has let free the two seas. Between them is a barrier. They meet, but yet they do not transgress this barrier. So we see, what is the meaning of these two seas meeting and yet they do not transgress? Now this served as a point of confusion for many people who had studied this, and they thought that this could not refer to the seas, because the seas apparently met, and then it does not explain the fact that they, if there's a barrier, how do they meet? So this seemed to be a contradiction, and they felt that perhaps this means that it does not refer to this. And in fact, what they thought it refers to is a phenomena of the water cycle, which we described. And it could also refer to that in a sense, but not exactly in this Quranic reference. We find that in the Quran, in the water cycle, water from the sea, which is predominantly salty, evaporates. And when it evaporates, it condenses in the higher layers and comes down as rain. And so the rain that comes down is in fact fresh water. And so we find that there is a cycle between fresh water and salty water, and there is this barrier between them because of the condensation that takes water to evaporate and not salt. And many commentators thought that perhaps this was a reference to this. It is only today they realize that this reference is a direct reference to the sea, and it's only through modern technology that we come to understand how the two seas meet and yet there's a barrier between them. How does this phenomenon occur? We find, for example, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Oceans. We find them meeting. Now, although there is a slanted water barrier between them, we now know that through this barrier, the water from one sea passes across to join the other sea. But the amazing thing is this: when the water from the one sea enters the other sea, it loses its own characteristics and becomes homogenized with the other water. And in this way, this barrier serves as a transitional homogenizing area for the two waters. Putting it another way, what this means is that, say for example, the one sea is more salty than the other, and the difference in temperature, the one sea being warmer than the other. Now we find there's a barrier between them. Now if the water from the warmer sea crosses over to the sea that is colder, that water immediately takes on the properties of the colder water. It becomes as cold as that water, and it has the same amount of salt as that water. So what happens is this barrier serves as a barrier which makes both waters remain distinct, and yet at the same time allows them to pass between each other. This is an absolutely phenomenal discovery, which only was discovered as a result of the high technology that we have today. And it illustrates the beauty of the Quran and how the miracles of the Quran are being revealed as our knowledge is advancing and as we come to understand this phenomena.